Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, February the 28th, 2024, we are commencing consideration of Bill C-354, an act to amend the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission Act, Quebec's cultural distinctiveness and French-speaking communities. Now, in the sponsor of this bill was Mario Beaulieu, and now we have Monsieur Martin Champoux, who is going to present on his behalf because he's not able to be here. Mr. Champoux, you have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and I will give you a 30-second cue when you're getting there. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, it's an honor to speak to you today on Bill 354 that was sponsored by my colleague Mario Beaulieu. He was unable to be here today, but I am pleased to speak to this bill in his name. It's a very simple bill, and it reads as follows. In the CRTC Act, in the section on broadcasting 12.1, the mission is part of the CRTC Act, and we want to add a consultation that they would have to consult Quebec on its specificity and other provincial governments with Francophone markets before taking on the powers in Part 1. This bill is not very complicated. It responds to a need coming from Mathieu Lacombe, a minister in Quebec, in a letter that he had sent to Pablo Rodriguez in February 2023. At that time, the Heritage Committee had completed its study on Bill C-11, a bill that sought to modify the CRTC Act, and it had made it to the Senate and had come back to the House to approve the final amendments proposed by the Senate. This is a request coming from Quebec, and among the recommendations sent to the minister, they had suggested that Quebec be consulted systematically when rules and decisions are made by the CRTC that would have an impact on Quebec culture, Francophone culture, and that would have an impact on the Quebec broadcasting system. The Bloc believes that telecommunications and broadcasting are essential for the vitality of Quebec culture. The broadcasting sector has a direct impact on our language and our culture. C-354 is a modest attempt to minimally meet the needs of Quebecers regarding their culture and the management of their broadcasting ecosystem. Quebec has its own rules and has always fought for more autonomy. Let's go back to 1929. None of us were there, but to let you know, Alexandre Taschereau had moved a bill on broadcasting in the province. Later in the 30s, the federal government took on the principle and created the Broadcasting Act and then the CRTC as we know it. But over the years, different Quebec governments and successive governments, and I want to specify, not all of them were separatists or there were federalist governments and liberal governments that fought for more autonomy for Quebec in broadcasting. In 2008, Christine Saint-Pierre and Benoît Pelletier, who were both liberal ministers for the Quebec government, had sent a letter and stated that Quebec wanted to have discussions to conclude an agreement with Canada on broadcasting and culture, considering that Quebec has a specific culture. We believe that such an administrative agreement would allow a better consideration of Quebec content in broadcasting and telecommunications, and would recognize the importance of protecting and promoting this cultural specificity. The CRTC's decisions have an impact on Francophone culture, Quebec culture, and CRTC decisions have an impact on broadcasting in Quebec, and we believe that it is important that Quebec be consulted before work is done on broadcasting and the Quebec and Francophone culture. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, so I will open this up to questions of the witness. Any questions? Mr. Noor Mohammed?
I just have one question for Mr. Champoux, for whom I have a tremendous amount of respect. Is it not problematic to try to legislate a direction? Oh, sorry, aren't they supposed to go first?
We always. I was just going to see whose hands went up. Nobody seemed to put their hands up. Are you going to start? Okay, sorry, I didn't. Thank you, Claire.
Rachel.
Okay, miss. Okay. We're splitting the time for 6 minutes with between Rachel Thomas and Joël Godin. Go ahead.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vais partager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be sharing my time with Ms. Thomas. Mr. Champoux, I raise my hat to you. In February 2023, the Conservative Party and the Bloc, during Bill C-11, had stated that there was asymmetry between Quebec and other provinces in Canada. Just look at the Official Languages Committee that I am vice chair at, and witnesses were treated a certain way. Another member mentioned that Quebec should be bilingual, and another member stated that there was no decline in Quebec. I'm not sure where the Liberals are trying to go with such comments. But Mr. Champoux, I would like to know, of course, the goal here is to allow Quebec to be consulted in order to protect its specificity. And why include other provinces and territories? Because you're basing this on Monsieur Lacombe, Minister for Culture, and two other Quebec Liberal ministers who stated that it was very important. I would like to hear your comments on that, please, Mr. Champoux. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Godin, for the question. It's a great one. And I'll give you a brief context. We often feel like the Bloc only speaks about Quebec, but it represents Quebec and Francophones outside. There's about 8 million Francophones amid 370 million Anglophones. And as you stated, Quebec is very different. But outside of Quebec, there are Francophone communities, and they are also very important. When you think of a bill that you want to apply in Quebec, we also have to think about Francophone communities outside of Quebec, and we have a lot of discussions with these communities. Adding in the other provinces was a way to share to those Francophone communities that we're not only looking to change things for Quebec. We know that you are also impacted by CRTC decisions, and you should also have a voice at the table. And so we want to talk about consultations with provinces. It doesn't have to be an obligation. Some provinces might say we don't want to be consulted, and it ends there. But I believe that it was important to send a message to Francophone communities outside of Quebec that with this proposal for the amendment, we were thinking beyond just Francophones in Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Champoux. Have you consulted?
2 minutes and 48 seconds, so I don't know if you want to give it over to Ms. Thomas. You let him say, okay, that's
Just
good. Go ahead.
The last minute, just tell me the last minute when finish my tour, and I split my time with Mrs. Thomas. Okay? How many time for her?
Well, we have 2 minutes and 45 seconds left in the whole 6 minutes.
OK. Monsieur Champoux, je voulais tout simplement vous...
Mr. Champoux, I wanted to ask, have you consulted official language minority communities outside of Quebec? And secondly, if we look at the CRTC Act, official language communities are consulted. And I have a question regarding adding another layer of consultation with the provinces and territories. And that might add an additional burden. Have you considered that, removing the other provinces and territories? That's a good question. This is something that was shared. We had discussions with representatives from different Francophone communities outside of Quebec, and we were told that the provincial government might not be the best contact for the CRTC to reach out to, and that the community should be communicated with by the CRTC. We could propose an amendment as long as it meets the needs of those Francophone communities outside of Quebec. Thank you, Martin.
Mitchell, you have 1 minute and 25 seconds.
Great. Thank you, Chair. At this point, I just wish to move a motion. I'm hoping that it'll be rather quick, certainly not wanting to interrupt, wanting to get back to the conversation that is at hand. I gave notice of this motion at our last meeting, and it reads as follows. Given the CBC receives $1.4 billion from taxpayers, the CBC holds the rights to broadcast the NHL playoffs. The CBC chose not to broadcast the Edmonton Oilers game that sent them to the Stanley Cup Finals. The committee calls on the CBC to commit to broadcasting all Stanley Cup final games and report this finding to the House. That is my motion that I wish to move on behalf of Canadians so that they can watch the Stanley Cup.
So the motion is on the table, duly presented 48 hours beforehand. So I'm sorry, we have on the motion. Yes, Mr. Nur Mohammed?
Well, Ms. Thomas will be happy to know that, in fact, the CBC is broadcasting the Oilers' Stanley Cup games and will indeed, I assume, also broadcast when they win the Stanley Cup, bringing the cup back home to Canada. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that. I also think it's important to note that, in fact, the rights holder is Rogers, who paid $5.2 billion for the rights through 25-26. But thanks to an arrangement that's been reached between Rogers and CBC, indeed, we don't even need to worry about this motion or vote for it because the CBC is already broadcasting the NHL Stanley Cup Finals, in which the Edmonton Oilers, I predict, will win the Stanley Cup.
Now, Ms. Ashton, on this motion. Thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to support this motion. I think it sends an important message. I think it's great that that agreement has been reached. Having said that, I think the fact that we haven't been able to watch hockey games in the CBC up to now is a problem. And I think it's a very strong message on behalf of Canadians to send as the committee that we support the CBC showing the playoffs and frankly hope that this sets a precedent for the future, as well as hopefully many more Canadian teams winning in the future, in addition to the Oilers this time.
On the motion?
Yeah, on the motion, maybe we should just add in the motion just the piece saying that it is going to be broadcast on the CBC, the final game. You have an amendment? Yeah, I'd like to make an amendment that... Can
you please tell us your amendment?
That the final game is going to be broadcast on the CBC. The final games, yeah.
Where do you wish that to go?
Just anywhere, it doesn't matter.
Part of the language? No, you have to tell us
at the very end. I would just like a little star, and the game will be played on CBC. The finals will be seen on CBC. How about that?
So we have an amendment, discussion of the amendment, Mr. Waugh.
How do we know that? Yeah, Ms. Tate stood in this room, talked glowingly about CBC and Hockey Night in Canada. Yet for Game 6, involving the Edmonton Oilers and the Dallas Stars, they decide to not televise it. There would have been a riot, Madam Chair, if they would have done this with the Toronto Maple Leafs or the Montreal Canadiens. They had no business not showing Game 6. They claim they had a commitment earlier. This has never happened in CBC. And then all of a sudden, because the Edmonton Oilers, a Western-based team, who I might say their 6 o'clock newscast is disastrous, CBC in Edmonton and Calgary, they saw fittingly not to show Game 6 of Edmonton and Dallas. I don't have any confidence on the CBC to show any of these games until I actually turn on the TV and see CBC televising them.
New Mohammed on the amendment.
I mean, I find it deeply, I don't even know what the word is to discuss this, because while I appreciate Mr. Coteau's amendment, I mean, I remain of the view that we should not be, as politicians, telling the CBC what to broadcast. So Mr. Coteau has rightly pointed out through this on this amendment to address the misinformation that the CBC is not going to be broadcasting these games, which in fact they are. I think it leads to a bigger question of, are we directing the public broadcaster of what to broadcast and what not to broadcast? So I think that's...
Yeah, okay, so. And not the main motion. Yes, Sébastien, you have something to say?
Ben oui,
on the amendment?
Oui, ben certaines petites choses. D'abord...
Yes. Are we talking about the 7th, the 4th, the 5th? I don't know which one will be the final match. But we're talking about Radio-Canada and the motion and CBC. I remember when I was a kid, I watched the Habs or the Nordiques, but that's over 20 years, and matches are no longer playing. And Rogers did pay a lot, and unfortunately, the Bloc will not be supporting the motion. Thank you.
Yes. Any further discussion on the amendment? No? No discussion on the amendment? Yes, this is what we're discussing. Until we vote on the amendment, we are dealing with the amendment.
If I can hear the amendment one more time before we vote on it. If we can hear the amendment before we vote on it.
The amendment is very simple. You said at the end of the motion, you add, the CBC will be broadcasting the final games.
Okay, that's great.
All right? So that's the amendment. Now, before I call the question on the amendment, I just want to make sure we know that we're voting on the amendment. And I just want to add something that said, this could have been the Canucks, you know, guys, if they hadn't dragged their feet. Okay, so just so you know that. All right, so the West has got to look at this thing, but I think the amendment, anyone opposed to the amendment, put your hands up, please. So we have opposition to the amendment. Okay, yeah, those. So now, Nikki, what are you doing with that vote? Are you voting for the amendment or against it?
On the amendment, I'm inclined not to support it, given that remains to be seen. I think that, anyway, yes, I
think we have, maybe we should call the vote because people were putting their hands up. Quickly, clerk. Calling the vote.
The vote is on the amendment of Mr. Coteau.
Oh, come on.
I withdraw the amendment. I withdraw the amendment.
All right, the amendment has been withdrawn, so we don't vote on the amendment. We're voting on the motion unamended and as is. Any discussion on the motion, finally? Mr. Noor Mohammed.
I would like to say one more thing about this. While my voice is going, I am so pleased to see the Conservative Party standing with the Edmonton Oilers, who expressed today their support for the 2S LGBTQI+ community by declaring it Pride Month, by using Pride Tape, and I hope that their caucus takes that signal and support for the Edmonton Oilers and brings it to their policies as well.
Point of order, Mr. Noor Mohammed. That's not a point of order. So yes, Monsieur, on the motion.
To my knowledge, we need to have unanimous consent to remove an amendment. Let's move to a vote on the amendment and then to the original motion.
Well, the amendment has been withdrawn, so there's no amendment on the table at the moment. So we're going to the motion.
Let's just vote on the motion.
So, all right, now where any further discussion? We're voting. Sébastien?
Ben, pour moi,
I think that it's important to note that we shouldn't interfere with CBC's programming. They need to stay independent, and that is why we are going to vote against. And for those who are interested, as spokesperson, I will still show solidarity with the Edmonton Oilers.
So now, we'll call a vote on the motion, unamended.
The vote is on the motion of Rachel Thomas. Mr. Noor Mohammed.
No.
Mr. Coteau. No. Ms. Dillon.
No.
Ms. Gainey.
No.
Madame Lapointe.
Contre.
Mr. Waugh.
Yes.
Ms. Thomas.
Ms. Thomas?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence. Sorry.
oui.
Yep.
Mr. Godin?
Monsieur Godin.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
Contre.
Ms. Ashton.
Yes.
Yes pour 6-6, nays contre 5-5.
The motion carries. Is that what you're saying? Did you say 6? No. Sorry, I didn't hear that. Sorry, guys. Whenever I speak, my thing seems to stay on my speaking, and Sorry, go ahead, clerk.
It was, my apologies, yes pour 5-5, nays contre 6-6.
Okay. The motion, I'm sorry, does not carry, Miss Thomas. Now, having ended that, let's go back to project. We have 5 minutes to contain any questions on Bill C-354. And so on the bill, I have Talib Noor Mohammed. Mr. Noor Mohammed, Talib.
I just have one question for my friend, Mr. Champoux. There's a lot of... I have a lot of concern about government directing independent arm's-length regulatory agencies to do something. And in this case, the duty to consult the government of Quebec would create an unreasonable burden on the CRTC and give direction, frankly, from Parliament to the CRTC. How do you reconcile the independence of the CRTC with specific direction from Parliament?
Merci, Madame la Présidente, pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I'm pleased to hear the question. If they have only this kind of a question, which is not a very strong question, they won't have a lot to go on to reject the bill or to. But this is the CRTC Act, which includes the ways in which the CRTC needs to act in studies and in decisions. Consulting Quebec is not ask Quebec to tell us what needs to be in the decision. That's not the point. It's that if the CRTC is to receive, or rather wants to implement a new directive from the government, from the House of Commons, and they're like, oh, well, this would have an impact on broadcasting, we're going to notify Quebec and communities, Francophone communities outside of Quebec will say, okay, this is what's happening, this is coming. We're giving them a heads up. If you have any comments, you can share them with us. That's it. It's not binding. It's not giving Quebec a power to influence CRTC decisions, but it gives notice to Quebec and other Francophone communities to share their concerns with the CRTC, just as a brief from a different organization would do. And it would give Quebec this option because of the specificity, or the distinctiveness, rather, that it has. So it can say, okay, this is what's coming, and we would like for you to be aware of these issues. That's all. Nothing more binding. It doesn't give any additional power to Quebec. It's just a matter of doing things more simply and with more respect to the Quebec nation.
The CRTC already consults with the government of Quebec and with other provinces. So if that is his concern, he need not worry. And with that, I will give my time back to the chair.
Now I have Sébastien for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witness. Welcome to our committee. First question, how would this have an impact on the current consultation process of the CRTC? It only has a very minimal impact on the current consultation process because all it would add is an awareness. And the CRTC will respect the cultural distinctiveness of Quebec and how the broadcasting system works, which is different from the rest of Canada. And so the CRTC would simply have to send notice to Quebec and say, we're going to be starting a study on broadcasting. We imagine you'll have comments. We're letting you know, please send your comments to us to avoid what happened with C11, that we receive expectations from Quebec when the bill is about to receive royal assent, which caused a lot of frustration, and rightfully so. And so the Bloc is trying to get ahead of things and avoid a situation like what happened with C11. So not much of an impact on the consultation process, and in fact, I think it will make it simpler. We do remember that. How does C354 help protect the Quebec and Francophone culture in North America? Communities outside of Quebec and those Francophone communities outside of Quebec are already very active in the CRTC's consultation process. They are systematically consulted. The only thing that it will add to what's already being done is to ensure that Quebec will be notified, and so that they will receive a warning of what's coming, what's about to be consulted on, and to allow Quebec to share comments, questions. And so it doesn't change much for the CRTC. It just allows Quebec to act more quickly when needed. For consultations, does this have to do with all regulations from the CRTC? Only the ones that would impact broadcasting in Quebec and those that would have an impact on the culture of Quebec and Francophone culture. I have two final questions. This consultation obligation does this add any power? It simply lets them know that they will be consulted. And what are the advantages for minority communities? We talked about this earlier with Mr. Gaudin's question, and we were a little bit pressed for time. We need to factor in this distinctiveness of Francophone communities outside of Quebec. They don't have the same reality as Francophones in Quebec. There's already a consultation process. What 354 proposes is to systematically consult the provinces and the territories eventually. We know there's a Francophone community in Yukon, for example. That said, when we are to study this with witnesses, I want us to hear concerns from Francophone communities outside of Quebec, because there could be a government in place, a provincial government that would be sensitive to their needs, and then a government that isn't. Look to New Brunswick. I don't know that Acadians would trust their current government to protect their interests. And so we need to factor in that distinctiveness. This consultation for provincial governments, I'm open to amendments. so that when we get to the final product, Francophone communities outside of Quebec, the groups that represent them, are satisfied with what is going to be put in place. Thank you, Mr. Champoux, for your leadership. I think I have about a minute left. Do you have anything to add? It's very nice to offer me that extra time. It's quite rare that we receive extra time, so I will take advantage of it. I just want to come back to Mr. Noor Mohamed's question. I feel like there's opposition to this proposal, and it's an ideological one, but when we look at 354 and what it is not a binding bill. It's not a bill that goes against Anglophone minority rights, which is very well served, that has its own broadcaster, radio stations, and it does not have a negative impact on those communities. And if it were to have an impact, I would love to hear comments. So I think that the arguments against are ideological, coming from a group. But I want to reassure them, it's not a separatist thing. We just want to recognize the cultural distinctiveness of Quebec, and that when decisions are made on broadcasting, it has an impact on Quebec's culture. That's the only goal. Consulting Quebec, telling them what's coming. Do you have any comments? Thank you, Monsieur Champoux.
Great. Nikki Ashton, 6 minutes.
OK, merci beaucoup. Ma première
Nikki,
question... OK. La relation...
The relationship between Francophone communities and the CRTC has been established for years. The CRTC knows Francophone actors that can talk about Francophone markets outside of Quebec. We need to encourage these relationships and ensure that the CRTC consults Francophone communities on things that would impact them. Would you support a change to support Francophone communities outside of Quebec on markets that are linked to them, all while respecting the cultural distinctiveness of Quebec, as mentioned in the bill? Thank you very much for the question. I had answered it a little bit earlier, but I'm happy to answer clearly now. Yes, we will do what we can so that Francophone communities outside of Quebec feel like this is a tool and that it's not going to have a negative impact on the system for them. Now let's go to an example, the disconnect between our institutions. For a podcast, Alone, a Love Story, CBC Podcast used a Parisian studio because a Quebec accent would not be as popular internationally. They changed their mind, but do you believe that if Quebec had been consulted, they would have recommended to use the Quebec accent? I think that CBC made a mistake, and the president recognized that mistake. I'm not sure how if consulted, they would have made recommendations on what accent to use, but I believe that if Quebec had been consulted, they would say, please do not set aside the Quebec accent. We need to be careful. And there's multiple different Quebec accents, by the way. And there are Francophone Canadian accents as well. There are dozens of different accents from Gaspésie, Abitibi. Apologies, Monsieur le Maire, that you have an accent from Abitibi. But all that to say that when we're doing dubbing for foreign markets, they use international French. And this is a more neutral French. It doesn't have such a strong accent. It's less strong than any French studios. And so what is produced in Quebec does not necessarily use a Quebec accent and will not be as popular. because what's produced in Paris is a lot less neutral than what we are able to do with our dubbing industries in Quebec. So perhaps it is something that we should talk about more. And when CBC has to translate those podcasts, they would think of that.
Of concerning statements from both the leader of the official opposition as well as the Conservatives in this committee attacking and referring to defunding the CBC. At the same time, we saw a direct line between the Liberals threatening cuts to the CBC at Radio-Can and CBC responding with layoffs. The loss of the CBC, Radio-Canada, would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for communities like the ones that I represent, for communities across the country who depend on the CBC for local news. It would also be a devastating loss for francophones outside of Quebec who look to Radio-Canada to get good journalism about their reality in their language, not to mention, obviously, the implications in Quebec itself. The Conservatives have played games, political games, when it comes to the future of CBC and by association the Radio-Canada. We know from the past that Conservatives haven't hesitated to cut the CBC and Radio-Can once in power like they did before. How do you see this bill helping empower media in French, including when it comes to protecting Radio-Canada?
C'est un projet de loi.
It's a bill that seeks to ask that the CRTC consult systematically Quebec and provinces or francophone communities outside of Quebec. This bill does not focus on what's happening with CBC and Radio-Canada, and I don't want to talk too much about it, but you know me and you know that I find this issue important, and I'm quite sensitive to it. But if Quebec were to be consulted on Radio-Canada, I believe that Quebec would state that Radio-Canada is essential to Francophone and Quebec culture. And so making cuts in the funding for the public broadcaster would be a serious mistake. But I cannot speak on behalf of the Quebec government. There were no consultations. But I would like to assume that Quebec would agree with me that Radio-Canada is important for culture.
The time is up. Yes, Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Madam Chair, it being 5:54, I would move that we adjourn the meeting.
Do I have any objection to that? Unanimously?
But I would, of course, thank the witness.
Point of order, we need to thank the witness before we leave.
We also thank the witness.
I would like to thank the witness for coming today and presenting to us. Thank you, Mr. Shampoo. Meeting adjourned.
Well, that was a good one.